Hello everyone, I welcome you to the online lecture series of CEC-UGC. Now this lecture is the second part of our ongoing discussion on Indian English literature and the evolution of this group of writings. So in the previous lecture we discussed about the first phase of evolution which spanned 1830 to 1900 and the different conditions which led to the rise of Indian English writing. Towards the end, we mentioned Lord Macaulay and his minutes on education, right? And we take off from there in this discussion now. Now, why is this speech by Macaulay important? Now, this was a speech which he gave in the Parliament in 1835. It is important because it led to the formalization of English education in British India. So basically what Macaulay advocated was for a formulation of a parliamentary act that would revise the existing norms or the existing attitude to education in British India, which was formulated by the government, by the British government in 1813. So he advocated for a shift from a focus on the vernacular languages, literature written in the Indian languages, which was then studied by the Orientalists. So he wanted a shift from this kind of a learning to an engagement with Western thought, sciences, and of course English education as well. So Lord Bentinck, who was the Governor General at that time, then did approve finally of this proposal which was put forward by Lord Macaulay, and thereafter in 1835 itself it was formalized and funds were allocated for the promotion of English education in British India. Now what's also important for us to understand are these two quotations which we see in Lord Macaulay's speech, which then give us a very clear view into the kind of perspective that was brewing at that time, right? He says that I have not found one among any of them, now them here refers to the Orientalists, who could deny that a single shelf of good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia, unquote. So what we notice over here is some kind of a superiority, right? The British superiority in their own culture, in their own learning, in their own thoughts and ideas, and some kind of a belittling of everything that was native. So this was one of the cornerstones of Macaulay's thought, and this kind of an attitude then led to the introduction of English in the Indian landscape, right? However, this was just an one perspective on it, that it indicated such racial superiority, so to say, and therefore argued in favor of English education. And on the other hand, the other idea that also informed Macaulay's speech was this, where he said that we must do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern. So this was the second motive of introducing English in India, in order to create a class of educated Indians who would then be like the intermediaries between the Britishers and the Indians, right? Yet another, at yet another point in his speech, he says that these people would then be brown in skin but white in thought. So basically his aim was to promote by means of Western education, or particularly English education, to create such a class of individuals who would then align with the thought structures of the British. So, but this speech then officially, formally led to the introduction of English education and a promotion of this education in British India 1835 onwards. Now, people, we move to the next phase of the evolution of this style of writing, which starts 1900 onwards and goes up till 1945. Now, the moment we hear of 1945, we clearly know that that's the year when India got independence. So around 1900s is the time when the national movement and all the fervor started brewing, right? And it was, and these decades were in fact characterized by a mass awakening and the associated literary expression as well. So this kind of energy to attain freedom from foreign rule, a mass mobilization, people coming together and rallying for their rights and justice and some kind of a freedom from the British rule were the ethos of the times that we are discussing. So from 1900s to 1945. So of course the writings that were also emerging at this time then very clearly reflected these same ideas. In fact, K.S. Iyengar, who is one of the oft quoted authorities on Indian English literature, he states that during this time, I quote, "Men of letters became men of action overnight, and men of action turned men of letters when an alien despotism threw them into prison," unquote. Now, what is to be noticed over here are these two important phrases, men of letters and men of action, right? Now, who were the men of letters? People who were writing or who were engaged in literary expression. And men of action were those who were engaged in this movement, on the front lines of this movement to free India. And this quotation clearly tells us that there was an organic connection between these two, a group of individuals. The men of letters became men of action overnight, and men of action became the men of letters. So we see how political thought then very clearly defined the writings of these times. Now the writers were no longer only focusing on the outmoded customs and practices of Indian society, unlike in the first phase, but instead now they started to write about the ideas of freedom, liberty, and that energy was very clearly evident in the creative expression of the time. So the ideals of justice, equality, freedom, all of these began to appear as common themes in writings of the times. Next, we also see is that, so inspired with this kind of political assertion, all the writers and poets started to express themselves freely and write about similar themes. So having then charted this, the sociological backdrop of the times, next we come to the literary landscape of the decades spanning 1900 to 1945. So talking about the literary landscape, we had Indian English prose and Indian English poetry, both of them flourishing at the time during the India's national movement. So some of the poets who are fondly remembered and those who contributed to the times were Sarojini Naidu, Rabindranath Tagore, Subramanya Bharati. So these poets were writing in English as well as in their vernacular languages. And what is particularly noticeable in their works is this energy to free one's own country from a foreign yoke, and that kind of vision of a free India, that vision of the India of their dreams, so to say. So that idealism is very clearly evident in their poems. So on the other hand, we had Indian English prose also that was flourishing at this time. And the three pillars of Indian English fiction around this time were R.K. Narayan, Mulk Raj Anand and Raja Rao. In fact, one cannot be mentioned without a reference to the other. So that was the kind of organic connection that existed between writings of these three writers. So if we look at the first one, R.K. Narayan, so most of us notice that there was a particular thought pattern or a dominant ideology or a dominant perspective that existed in their works. So in R.K. Narayan, there is a particular critical attitude towards the entrenched prejudices in Indian society. He represents these prejudices and biases at work in Indian society in his fiction. We see how his characters grapple with them on a day-to-day basis, and by means of that then the writer is successful in creating some kind of a suspicion of any such thought structure or pattern that is biased and curtails human freedom. So that was the contribution that Narayan made to the literary landscape of the Indian English prose at the time. And some of the popular works that he wrote were Swami and Friends, The Bachelor of Arts, and The English Teacher. So in fact, this is very popularly referred to as a semi-autobiographical trilogy by the author, right? And yet another popular book by him was The Guide, which also was then adapted into the very popular Bollywood film by the same name, right? So the next we have is Mulk Raj Anand. Now, the kind of ideas that dominated his works involved the emancipation from foreign rule. So this was the emphasis that one found in Mulk Raj Anand's works. So this sense of patriotism, or this sense of envisioning a free country of one's own, and at the same time doing away with or getting free from the British rule. So his works then captured that reality, captured the problems faced by the Indians under the British. What were the shortcomings of such a colonial rule, and how Indians then suffered in such a atmosphere. So while he looked at that, at the same time he also talked about the potentialities inherent in the Indian society to then envision that new India that would be of their own making, completely free from any foreign influence. So some of the important works by Mulk Raj Anand include Coolie, The Untouchable, The Big Heart, etc. So he was also a prolific fiction writer, and he wrote a number of texts, but The Untouchable and Coolie are the oft quoted ones from his oeuvre. Next, of course, is Raja Rao. What he talked about was he emphasized on the need of a new fervor, a new passion in India's villages and towns. So he looked at, or he represented India's villages and towns, and the kind of values that were governing in the people's lives over there. And by means of that kind of a representation, he brought out the idea how there was a need of this kind of a fervor and passion amongst people, because these were the values that were then defining the times as well, right? And one of the most characteristic works of this thought by Raja Rao, of course, is Kantapura. So Kantapura talks about the South Indian village and the way that village is still dealing with certain caste biases, how the individuals over there grapple with this kind of reality. And at the same time, he also looked at the impact of Gandhian philosophy. So the kind of influence that Gandhi was having on the Indian youth, especially the youth in India's villages, is very sensitively captured by this author. So what is important then is this kind of a complex reality that he weaves in his fiction about the impact of Gandhian philosophy on the youth and the other members of the society alike. So therefore we see that how this was a time which was very, very energetic. There was a fervor for nationalism. There was a renewed energy in everybody to work together towards achieving that common goal of freeing one's nation from the foreign yoke, and at the same time collectively visualizing the India of their dreams, so to say. So all these values then also were reflected in the writings that flourished at the time, writings that were written in English as well as in the native languages. But we have clearly noticed the emphasis that that is observed in the Indian English writers and poets, particularly Mulkraj Anand, Raja Rao, R.K. Narayan, Sarojini Naidu, Subramania Bharti, Rabindranath Tagore, to name a few. So with this, of course, we understand the socio-historical landscape of the years spanning 1900s to 1945, and how they influenced Indian English writing, and what was the character of literature produced of the times. Thank you.